To the casual observer walking the boulevards of Paris or the manicured parks of London in the early years of the 20th century, civilization had reached its zenith. The Belle Époque was a gilded age of art, science, and apparent tranquility, where the crowned heads of Europe, often related by blood, gathered for christenings and funerals with familial warmth. Yet beneath this veneer of polite diplomacy and imperial grandeur, a dark industrial heart was beating with accelerating rhythm. The nations of the continent were not merely enjoying the peace, they were actively preparing for its destruction. In the smoky districts of the Ruhr, the Midlands, and the outskirts of St. Petersburg, the factories were no longer just producing textiles and railways, they were retooling for slaughter. A psychological shift had occurred, invisible to the café society, but palpable in the war ministries. The belief that peace was merely an interlude between wars. This was the dawn of the Great Armament, a period where national prestige became inextricably linked to the caliber of one's cannons and the tonnage of one's steel. The world was sleepwalking toward the abyss, guided by the flickering gaslight of a prosperity that was arming itself to the teeth.
The catalyst for this global anxiety was not initially found in the trenches, but upon the waves. In 1890, an American naval officer named Alfred Thayer Mahan published The Influence of Sea Power Upon History, a book that would become the Bible of imperialism. Mahan argued that national greatness was inextricably tied to the control of the oceans. His words were devoured by every ambitious leader, from Washington to Tokyo, but nowhere did they resonate more dangerously than in Berlin. For centuries, the British Royal Navy had reigned supreme, the undisputed guarantor of global trade and the Pax Britannica. But the German Empire, newly unified and surging with industrial might, began to view this British hegemony not as a stabilizer, but as a shackle. Germany wanted its place in the sun, and under Mahan's influence, they believed the only path to global status lay in the construction of a massive battle fleet. This intellectual pivot transformed the ocean from a highway of commerce into the primary arena of a new existential competition. The blue water was no longer neutral territory. It was the chessboard upon which the fate of empires would be decided.
In 1906, the naval arms race underwent a violent revolution with the launch of a single ship, the HMS Dreadnought. Conceived by the erratic but brilliant British First Sea Lord Jackie Fisher, the Dreadnought was not merely an improvement, it was a total reset of naval warfare. Armed with 10 12-inch guns and powered by revolutionary steam turbines, it was faster, tougher, and more lethal than anything that had come before. In a single stroke, it rendered every other battleship in existence, including Britain's own vast fleet, obsolete overnight. The irony was profound. By building the ultimate weapon to secure their dominance, the British had accidentally leveled the playing field. Germany no longer needed to catch up to centuries of British shipbuilding. They only needed to build more dreadnoughts than Britain from this moment forward. The race was now a sprint. Shipyards in Portsmouth, Kiel, Hamburg, and Glasgow began working around the clock. The distinctive clang of riveting hammers became the soundtrack of the decade as national budgets were hollowed out to feed the insatiable hunger for these steel leviathans.
Across the North Sea, the challenge was accepted with zealous determination. Kaiser Wilhelm II, grandson of Queen Victoria, harbored a deep, conflicted envy of the British. He loved the Royal Navy, but he hated that Germany did not possess its equal. Beside him stood Admiral Alfred von Tirpitz, the architect of the German High Seas Fleet. Tirpitz formulated the risk theory, a strategic gamble which posited that Germany didn't need to defeat the Royal Navy outright. It only needed a fleet large enough that any British victory would be so Pyrrhic it would leave Britain vulnerable to other powers. This threat, Tirpitz believed, would force Britain to accommodate German ambitions. It was a spectacular miscalculation. Instead of cowing the British, the German naval buildup panicked them into a frenzy. The German Navy League produced propaganda posters for schools, indoctrinating a generation of children to look to the sea. The widening of the Kiel Canal to accommodate the new German dreadnoughts became a national project of immense symbolic weight. Berlin was challenging London's very existence, turning a traditional friendship into a bitter, cold rivalry.
While the Titans clashed at sea, a different but equally dangerous philosophy took hold on the continent, the cult of the offensive. In France, the humiliation of 1871, where they had lost the provinces of Alsace and Lorraine to Prussia, burned like an open wound. The French High Command, led by General Joffre, rejected the defensive strategies of the past. They embraced Plan 17, a doctrine based entirely on élan vital, the fighting spirit. They believed that pure aggression, the bayonet charge, and the will to conquer could overcome superior German firepower. This wasn't just tactics, it was a mystical belief in French destiny. Consequently, while other nations moved toward drab camouflage, the French army stubbornly retained their 19th century uniforms, blue coats and bright red trousers. They reasoned that camouflage was cowardly and that the sight of the red trousers would inspire the men and terrify the enemy. It was a romantic delusion that ignored the reality of the machine gun, a tragic miscalculation that would soon paint the green fields of the frontiers with a different shade of red.
To the east lay the enigma that kept German strategists awake at night, the Russian Empire. After a humiliating defeat by Japan in 1905, the Russian bear was modernizing at a terrifying speed. Financed by massive loans from their French allies, the Tsar was rebuilding his army and, crucially, expanding the railway network toward the German border. The Great Program of 1914 aimed to increase the peacetime army to nearly 2 million men. For Germany, this was the ultimate nightmare: encirclement. They calculated that by 1916 or 1917, the Russian railway system would be efficient enough to mobilize their vast manpower faster than Germany could defeat France. This created a dangerous window of opportunity in the minds of the German General Staff. They began to believe that if war was inevitable, it had to happen sooner rather than later, before the Russian steamroller became unstoppable. The arms race here was not just about guns, but about time itself. Every mile of track laid in Poland was seen in Berlin as a tightening noose around the neck of the German Empire.
To solve this riddle of a two-front war against France and Russia, Germany devised the most famous and fatal military plan in history, the Schlieffen Plan. Drafted by Count Alfred von Schlieffen, it was a blueprint for a lightning war. The plan required the German army to ignore neutrality, smash through Belgium, and sweep into France to capture Paris within exactly 42 days. Only after knocking out France would the German trains turn east to face the slow-moving Russians. It was a plan of exquisite mathematical precision, but it was brittle. It left no room for error, for diplomacy, or for delay. The plan dictated that mobilization was war. Once the button was pushed and the millions of timetabled trains began to move, they could not be stopped without causing chaos. This reliance on rigid schedules meant that in a crisis, the military logistical needs would override political caution. The Schlieffen Plan transformed the German military into a loaded gun with a hair trigger pointed directly at the heart of Europe. Behind the generals and the admirals stood the true beneficiaries of this escalation: the merchants of death. The arms race was fueled by a private industrial complex of unprecedented scale. In Germany, the Krupp family ruled over a steel dynasty in Essen, earning the nickname the Cannon King. In Britain, Vickers and Armstrong engaged in lucrative competition. In Austria-Hungary, the Skoda works churned out siege howitzers. These companies didn't just fill orders, they actively marketed war. They sold weapons to their own governments and often to potential enemies, indifferent to the flag the shells would eventually fly under. Technological innovation was driven by profit margins. The competition to build the biggest gun or the thickest armor plate created a self-sustaining cycle of obsolescence and replacement. The sheer economic weight of these industries gave them immense political influence. Peace was bad for business, and the factories of Europe were booming. They were forging the chains that would bind the nations to a destiny of violence, all while paying handsome dividends to their shareholders. The weapons emerging from these factories were not merely larger versions of the past. They were fundamentally different, promising a harvest of death on an industrial scale. The Maxim gun, a machine gun capable of firing 600 rounds per minute, had turned the infantry charge into suicide, though few generals admitted it. In the skies, Count Zeppelin's dirigibles cast long, ominous shadows over cities, bringing the terrifying prospect of war to the home front for the first time. In secret laboratories, chemists were already exploring the dark potential of weaponized gas. But the pride of the armories were the super-heavy siege guns, like the Big Bertha, designed to smash the unsmashable forts of Belgium. There was a profound disconnect between this 20th century technology and the 19th century mindset of the men who commanded it. They planned for a war of movement and chivalry, unaware that their own inventions had already dictated a war of stagnation and slaughter. The tools were ready. They only awaited the hands to use them.
The dress rehearsal for Armageddon took place in the Balkans. This volatile region, the powder keg of Europe, saw two brutal wars in 1912 and 1913. Here, the waning power of the Ottoman Empire collapsed, triggering a scramble for territory among Serbia, Bulgaria, Greece, and Montenegro. It was a localized arms race within the greater one. The great powers watched closely, sending observers to study the effectiveness of their sold weapons. They saw the devastating power of modern artillery and the misery of trench warfare. Yet they drew the wrong conclusions. They saw the Balkan conflicts as short and sharp, reinforcing the illusion that modern war would be brief. But for the people of the region, the violence left deep scars and unsatisfied nationalisms, particularly in Serbia. The success of the Serbian army alarmed Austria-Hungary, who saw Belgrade as a magnet for Slavic separatism within their own empire. The Balkan Wars primed the explosive charge. All that was needed was a spark to ignite the fuse that led back to the stockpiles in Berlin, Paris, and St. Petersburg.
By the summer of 1914, the machine was built, fueled, and primed. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo on June 28th was the tragedy that triggered the mechanism. But it was the arms race that ensured the outcome would be a world war, not a local dispute. In the crucial days of July, the rigidity of the military plans took over. Diplomatic telegrams flew between monarchs, cousins begging cousins to stop. But the generals advised that waiting was suicide. To mobilize second was to lose. The relentless logic of the Schlieffen plan, the fear of the Russian railway schedules, the pride of the battle fleets, all these structural forces crushed the possibility of peace. The nations were prisoners of their own preparations. They had built doomsday machines that, once activated, could not be switched off. As the ultimatums expired, the factory whistles blew, not for the morning shift, but for the gathering of armies. The great industrial engines of Europe roared to life, drowning out the last whispers of reason.
And so the world of 1914, the world of the Belle Époque, ended not with a whimper, but with the thunder of the guns it had so lovingly crafted. The arms race had promised security. Instead, it delivered a catastrophe. The crowds in Berlin, Paris, and London cheered as the troops marched out, showering them with flowers, believing they would be home by Christmas. They could not see the 4 years of mud, blood, and ruin that lay ahead. They were cheering for their own destruction. The militarism that had seeped into the soul of the continent had finally demanded its price. The dreadful fleets steamed into the North Sea, the artillery trains rumbled toward the frontiers, and the youth of a generation stepped forward into the mechanical grinder. The old world was dying, and the new world, a world of total war, was being born in fire and steel. The race was over. The slaughter had begun.